What if humanity wasn't created to inherit the earth, but to replace something that failed before us? Beneath the sun-bleached plains of southern Iraq, where the Tigris and Euphrates once carved the cradle of civilization from desert silence, clay tablets still rest in museum vaults, their cuneiform wedges preserving a memory older than kingship itself, a memory of creation that happened not once but twice. The Atrahasis epic, pressed into wet clay nearly 4,000 years ago, describes the gods fashioning humanity to perform labour. But buried within its administrative language lies something disturbing. An earlier attempt, a prototype species, beings who carried divine blood but proved unmanageable, whose existence was quietly erased before we were made to take their place. The tablets do not celebrate our creation, they document a correction. So before this story pulls you under, take a moment to like and subscribe, only if you're drawn to histories that question what we think. We know about beginnings, and if you're still listening, leave a comment telling me where you are and what time it is. I'd like to imagine this quiet stretching across the world, connecting listeners in the dark. In the basement archives of the British Museum, behind climate-controlled doors and beneath fluorescent lights that hum with institutional patience, a clay tablet no larger than a modern paperback rests in protective storage, its surface covered in wedge-shaped impressions made by a reed stylus nearly 4,000 years ago. And this unassuming fragment of baked earth, catalogued simply as number 78941, contains what may be the most unsettling creation narrative ever recovered from the ancient world. Not because it describes humanity being formed from divine love or cosmic intention, but because it describes us being manufactured as a solution to a labour crisis, a replacement workforce designed to perform tasks that someone else had grown tired of doing. The tablet was excavated in the late 19th century from the ruins of ancient Sippar, a city that once stood along the Euphrates in what is now central Iraq, and for decades it sat in storage alongside thousands of other cuneiform fragments, its significance unrecognised, its text only partially readable due to damage and the sheer difficulty of translating Old Babylonian Akkadian with precision. Then in 1965, a British Assyriologist named Wilfred George Lambert completed what would become the definitive translation, piecing together this tablet with related fragments from other collections to reconstruct one of the most complete versions of the Atrahasis epic ever assembled. And when scholars finally read what the ancient scribes had pressed into wet clay around 1800 BC, they found themselves confronting a creation story that read less like theology and more like administrative documentation, less like sacred myth, and more like the minutes of a divine committee meeting where difficult decisions were made about resource allocation and workforce management. The Atrahasis epic opens not with the birth of the cosmos or the separation of heaven and earth, but with a complaint, a grievance filed by workers who had reached the limits of their endurance, and the workers in question were not human because humans did not yet exist. They were the Agigi, a class of younger gods who had been assigned the physical labour necessary to maintain the ordered universe, digging canals, dredging rivers, clearing irrigation channels, performing the endless agricultural work that kept the cosmic infrastructure functioning. For 40 years, or perhaps 40 symbolic periods that the text treats as a meaningful duration, the Agigi laboured under the supervision of the senior gods, the Anunnaki, who occupied positions of administrative authority and did not themselves perform manual work. And this hierarchical arrangement between divine labourers and divine managers persisted until something broke, until the burden became unbearable, until the Agigi decided they would no longer comply. The text describes what happened next with remarkable specificity. The Agigi set their tools on fire, they burned the implements of their labour in an act of deliberate destruction, and then they marched as a group to the dwelling of Enlil, the chief executive among the gods, surrounding his house in what can only be described as a divine labour strike, a collective action demanding change. And when Enlil emerged to confront the mob of rebellious workers, he was reportedly frightened. The text uses language suggesting genuine alarm at the sight of unified resistance, and he immediately summoned an emergency council of the great gods to determine how to respond to this unprecedented crisis. The Anunnaki gathered to deliberate, and what they discussed was not punishment for the rebellious workers, not suppression of the uprising through force, but rather a fundamental restructuring of the system itself, an acknowledgement that the current arrangement was unsustainable, and that something new would need to be created to absorb the labour the Agigi refused to continue performing. This is where the creation of humanity enters the narrative, not as the crowning achievement of divine artistry, not as the beloved centrepiece of cosmic intention, but as a practical solution to an administrative problem, a proposal put forward in the most utilitarian terms imaginable. Let us create a primitive worker. Let this being assume the drudgery of the gods. Let the human carry the yoke so that the Igigi may rest. The language here deserves careful attention because it shapes everything that follows. The word typically translated as primitive worker is the Akkadian lulu, which carries connotations of something crude, something not fully refined, something functional rather than elegant. And the phrase about assuming drudgery uses terminology drawn from labour management, from the vocabulary of task assignment and burden distribution. There is no celebration here, no poetry about the wonder of creation, just the cold logic of governance facing an unsustainable situation and devising an expedient response. The goddess Nintu, also known as Mami or Ninhursag depending on which tradition is being referenced, was assigned the task of actually creating this new being, and the process described involves mixing clay with the blood of a slain god, a deity named Geshtu, or in some versions Wee-Ilu, who was apparently sacrificed specifically to provide the divine component that would animate the clay and give the new creation some measure of intelligence and spirit. Even this detail carries disturbing implications. The first act in humanity existence was a killing, a sacrifice, the destruction of one divine being to enable the manufacture of another category of being entirely. And the blood that flows through human veins, metaphorically speaking, is the blood of something that was slaughtered to make us possible. We are not simply shaped from earth. We are animated by violence, by the remnants of a god who was selected for termination so that his essence could be repurposed. The Atrahasis describes Nintu performing the creation in batches, shaping 14 pieces of clay, 7 male and 7 female, setting them in pairs, birthing humanity not as individuals but as a production run, a manufactured cohort designed to immediately begin performing the labour that the Igigi had abandoned. And within the text there is a matter-of-fact quality to all of this, a bureaucratic fatness that refuses to mythologize what is being described, as if the scribe copying these words understood them as historical record rather than symbolic narrative, as documentation of events that actually occurred rather than poetic interpretation of cosmic mysteries. The British Museum tablet and its companion fragments preserve this account with the clinical precision of administrative archives, the same tone used elsewhere in Mesopotamian literature to record grain distributions and temple inventories and land surveys. And this tonal consistency is part of what makes the Atrahasis so unsettling to modern readers who expect creation myths to soar with religious feeling, to invest the origin of humanity with transcendent significance, to make us feel special and chosen and loved into existence. But the Atrahasis offers none of that comfort. It presents creation as problem-solving, as crisis management, as the moment when divine governance faced systemic failure and devised a workaround that happened to be us. The distinction between the Anunnaki and the Igigi becomes crucial for understanding the structure of this ancient cosmology. The Anunnaki occupied the senior tier of divine hierarchy. They made decisions, issued decrees, allocated resources, and governed the cosmic order from positions of authority, while the Igigi occupied the junior tier, performing the physical work that maintained the systems the Anunnaki had established. And this division between administrators and labourers, between those who command and those who execute, mirrors patterns that would repeat throughout human history. Perhaps because we inherited the template, perhaps because the template was designed into us from the beginning. When the Igigi rebelled, they were demanding recognition that the current arrangement was unjust, that the burden of eternal labour without relief or rotation or advancement was more than any being should be expected to bear. And the Anunnaki response was not to share the work themselves, not to rotate responsibilities, not to restructure the system toward greater equality, but to create an entirely new class of being to absorb the unwanted tasks, to manufacture workers who would accept what the previous workers had rejected, to solve the problem of divine labour resistance by introducing beings who had no choice in the matter because they were made specifically for the purpose of service. The implications of this framing extend far beyond ancient theology. If the oldest preserved account of human origins describes us as manufactured replacements for rebellious workers, as beings designed to perform labour that others refused, then what does that suggest about the nature of human existence? About the purpose built into our very creation? About why we seem so incapable of resting, so driven to work, so comfortable with idleness, so prone to filling every available moment with productive activity, as if something in our design compels us towards perpetual motion? The Atrahasis does not answer these questions directly. It simply records what the ancient scribes believed had happened, presenting the information with the same administrative neutrality applied to tax records and boundary disputes, and that neutrality itself constitutes a kind of answer, or at least a kind of testimony, because it suggests the scribes did not consider this account mythological in the sense we use that word today. They were not composing symbolic literature meant to be interpreted metaphorically. They were preserving what they understood as factual history, the documented origin of the beings who now perform the labour that once belonged to gods. The tablet sits today in its climate-controlled chamber in London, a physical object that has survived nearly 4 millennia of human history, through the rise and fall of empires, through floods and fires and the slow, patient work of archaeological excavation, through translation efforts spanning more than a century, and the wedge-shaped impressions pressed into its surface by a scribe who lived and died before Moses, before Homer, before Buddha, before nearly every figure we consider ancient. Those impressions still preserve a memory that challenges everything we assume about the dignity of human origins, about the love that supposedly called us into being, about our place in the cosmic order. But here is where the text grows stranger still, because the Atrahasis does not present the creation of humanity as the beginning of the story, it presents it as a response to something that came before, as a solution to a problem that predated our existence. And if the Igigi were performing labour before humans were created, if the cosmic infrastructure was already functioning, if the gods were already governing an ordered world that required maintenance, then something was already there. Something was already working. And our creation was not the start of the project, but a personnel change midway through. The text implies layers beneath layers, earlier arrangements preceding the one we entered, a cosmos that had operated under different terms before the terms were renegotiated at the moment of our manufacture. And this implication sits quietly within the cuneiform impressions, waiting for readers to notice what the scribe considered too obvious to emphasize, that humanity arrived into an ongoing story, that we were not the first chapter but a revision, that the world we inherited was not made for us but was already made and we were made to serve it. So the question emerges slowly, rising like dust motes in a shaft of ancient light. If this was creation, if this was how humanity began, why does the text describe what came before us? Why does it preserve the memory of the Igigi and their rebellion? Why does it hint at arrangements that preceded the arrangement we entered? And if we were made as replacements, what exactly were we replacing? And what happened to the beings or the systems or the order that we were designed to supersede? The Atrahasis continues beyond this point, describing what happened after humanity was created, and what happened was not the peaceful functioning the gods had intended. Something went wrong with the new creation too, something that would require even more drastic intervention than replacing divine labourers with manufactured workers, and the text remembers that intervention with the same administrative precision it applies to everything else, recording without commentary, preserving without interpretation, leaving later generations to wonder what the ancient scribes understood that we have forgotten how to read. The Atrahasis epic presents the creation of humanity as a solution, a response to crisis, a manufactured workforce designed to replace divine labourers who had refused to continue their assigned tasks, but buried within this narrative and scattered across related texts preserved in museum collections from London to Philadelphia to Istanbul lies a more unsettling implication, one that scholars have noted but rarely emphasised, one that the ancient scribes recorded with the same administrative precision they applied to everything else. The implication that humanity as we know it was not the first attempt at creation, that something existed before us, something that also carried divine essence, something that proved unsuitable and had to be corrected or replaced, or perhaps eliminated entirely before we could take our place in the cosmic labour system. The Eridugenesis, preserved in fragmentary form on tablets excavated from the ancient city of Nippur and now housed in the University of Pennsylvania Museum, describes the period before the flood in terms that parallel the Atrahasis, but include details that complicate the standard creation narrative. References to beings who existed in an earlier age, who lived differently than the humans who came after, who possessed qualities that distinguished them from the version of humanity that would eventually inherit the Earth. And these references sit quietly in the cuneiform text like fossils embedded in stone. evidence of something that once lived but no longer walks among the categories we recognize. The Agigi themselves represent the first layer of this mystery. Divine beings assigned to labor before humans existed, performing for 40 years or 40 symbolic periods the work of maintaining cosmic infrastructure, digging and dredging and clearing the channels that kept the ordered world functioning. And if the divine beings were performing this labor, if the gods themselves were once the workforce, then the system was designed to operate without human participation. Humanity was an addition to a functioning order rather than the purpose for which the order was created. We entered a story already in progress, rather than initiating the story ourselves. But the Agigi were gods, lesser gods perhaps, junior members of the divine hierarchy, but gods nonetheless, and their rebellion was treated as a legitimate grievance rather than a crime. The senior gods responded with negotiation and restructuring rather than punishment. They created humans to assume the burden the Agigi rejected, rather than forcing the Agigi to continue against their will. And this suggests a cosmos governed by something resembling labor rights, by recognition that even divine workers could reach the limits of acceptable burden, that the system had to be modified when its demands exceeded what its participants would tolerate. The creation of humanity, as described in the Atrahasis, involves a specific process that deserves closer examination. The goddess Nintu mixes clay with the blood of a slain god, a deity whose name appears in different versions as Geshtu E or Wi Ailu, a figure about whom almost nothing else is known except that he was killed specifically to provide the animating essence that would give the new creation intelligence and spirit, and the capacity to perform complex labor. And this sacrificial killing raises questions that the text does not directly answer. Why this particular god? What was his status in the divine hierarchy? Was he chosen randomly or selected for specific qualities? Was his death a punishment or honor, or simply an administrative necessity? The text records the fact without explaining the reasoning, as if the scribes themselves no longer knew or never considered the details important enough to preserve. The Sumerian term lulu, which appears in various creation texts and is typically translated as primitive human or primitive worker, carries implications that scholars have debated for over a century. The word suggests something crude or unrefined, something not fully developed, something that represents an early stage rather than a finished product. And when the texts use this term to describe the first humans, they seem to be distinguishing these beings from something else, from a more refined category that either existed previously or would develop later. The very vocabulary implies a hierarchy of humanness, levels of development that separate what we might call prototype from production model. W.G. Lambert, the British Assyriologist whose 1969 translation of the Atrahasis remains foundational to scholarly understanding of the text, noted in his commentary that the Mesopotamian creation traditions contain hints of earlier experiments, beings created before the current version of humanity who proved unsatisfactory for reasons the surviving texts do not fully explain, and Lambert approached these hints with appropriate scholarly caution, noting them without building elaborate theories upon fragmentary evidence, but the hints themselves persist in the textual record, scattered references to beings who existed in an earlier age, who possessed divine blood like humans but lacked the constraints that would be built into the later design, who became problematic in ways that required intervention. The concept of noise appears repeatedly in the Mesopotamian flood narratives, the gods deciding to destroy humanity because the humans had become too noisy, too clamorous, too disruptive to the cosmic order. And the Akkadian word used, rigmu, carries meanings beyond simple sounds, suggesting chaos, disorder, systemic disruption, the kind of noise that represents breakdown rather than mere loudness. But here is what the texts imply without stating directly. If the gods needed to destroy humanity because of noise, and if the flood was their method of doing so, then the humans who existed before the flood were not identical to the humans who came after. The post-flood version was modified, constrained, limited in ways designed to prevent the noise problem from recurring. And this means the pre-flood humans were an earlier iteration, a version that failed to meet specifications, a prototype that worked well enough to reproduce and multiply, but carried flaws that ultimately required correction. The Atrahasis describes what happened after humanity was created and began performing the labor the Agigi had abandoned. The humans multiplied. They spread across the earth. They filled the land with their presence and their activity, and with their ceaseless production of whatever the gods found intolerable. And Enlil, the same deity who had been frightened by the Agigi rebellion, found himself unable to sleep because of the disturbance rising from the human population below, and his response was not negotiation or restructuring but annihilation, a series of plagues and famines and finally the flood itself, designed to wipe out the creation that had exceeded its intended parameters. The god Enki, who appears in multiple traditions as the deity most sympathetic to humanity, the one who designed our essential nature and defended our existence against divine hostility. This same Enki warned a human named Atrahasis of the coming flood and instructed him to build a boat that would survive the deluge, preserving a seed of humanity through the destruction, and when the waters receded, an Atrahasis emerged to offer sacrifice. The gods who smelled the sweet savour of burnt offerings realised they had made an error. They had destroyed their workforce, eliminated the beings who performed the labour they themselves no longer wished to do, and now the irrigation channels would silt up and the fields would go untended, and the cosmic infrastructure would decay for lack of maintenance. This is when the text describes something crucial, a renegotiation of the terms of human existence, new limitations imposed on the surviving population to prevent the noise problem from recurring, women who would be forbidden to bear children, demons who would snatch infants, categories of infertility and early death that would keep human numbers within manageable bounds. And if these limitations were imposed after the flood as corrective measures, then the humans who existed before the flood lacked these constraints. They were a version of humanity that could reproduce without limit, that could spread without check, that could fill the earth with their presence until the gods themselves could not rest. An earlier design that contained a fundamental flaw. The Atemmu, a Sumerian and Akkadian concept typically translated as spirit or ghost or shade of the dead, appears in the creation narratives as one of the components that animates human beings. The blood of the slain god Geshtui carried his Atemmu, which was bound into the clay along with the physical substance, giving humans an eternal spiritual component that would survive bodily death and descend to the underworld. And this binding of spirit to clay raises its own questions. Was Geshtui the only source of Atemmu used in human creation, or were there others? Were the spirits of earlier failed creations somehow recycled into the newer version? Is there something in human spiritual composition that carries the residue of previous experiments, echoes of beings who walked the earth before we did, and whose essence was repurposed rather than discarded? The fragmentary nature of the surviving text makes definitive answers impossible. We are working with tablets that were broken and buried for millennia, with copies made by scribes who may not have fully understood the sources they were transcribing, with traditions that evolved and changed across centuries of transmission, and scholars like Lambert have spent careers piecing together what can be reconstructed while acknowledging how much has been lost. But the pattern that emerges from the fragments is consistent. The texts remember something before humanity. They remember creation as a process of revision rather than a single perfect act. They remember beings who failed and were replaced, and whose replacement was itself imperfect and required further modification after the flood. The Yale Babylonian collection contains tablets that preserve variant versions of creation narratives, some including details absent from the British Museum Atrahasis, references to multiple attempts at forming human beings, to prototypes that lacked proper function, to the goddess Nintu experimenting with different mixtures before achieving a viable result. And while some scholars interpret these references as describing the creation of individuals with disabilities as mythological explanations for human variation, others have suggested they preserve memory of earlier stages in the creation process, versions that did not work correctly and had to be set aside before the final version could be produced. The Sumerian text known as Enki and Ninmah describes precisely this kind of experimental creation, Enki and the mother goddess engaging in what appears to be a contest or collaboration to shape beings from clay, producing figures that cannot eat, that cannot reproduce, that lack essential capacities, and Enki finding roles for each of these imperfect creations, positions in the cosmic order where their limitations would not prevent them from contributing. And whether this text describes the origin of human disability or the memory of prototype beings that preceded viable humanity, it confirms that Mesopotamian tradition imagined creation as iterative, as a process involving trial and error, as something that did not succeed perfectly on the first attempt. The 40 years or 40 symbolic periods during which the Igigi laboured before rebelling represent an epoch before human existence, a time when the divine order operated under different terms, when the work of maintaining civilization was performed by gods rather than manufactured workers. And if we count backward from the creation of humanity through this period of divine labour to whatever preceded it, we find ourselves in territory the texts barely illuminate, hints of chaos before order, of primordial conditions before the current arrangement was established, of something that existed in the before time that had to be subdued or organized or replaced before the world as the Mesopotamians knew it could function. The blood of Geshtu-E, poured into the clay that would become human flesh, carried something essential from the divine realm into the manufactured bodies of the new workforce: intelligence and spirit and the capacity for complex thought, but it also carried something else, the substance of a being who had been killed to make us possible, the residue of a death that inaugurated our existence. And whether Geshtu-E was the only divine casualty of human creation or merely the one whose name survived in the textual record, the principle remains: we are animated by sacrifice, by the destruction of something that came before, by blood that once flowed through different veins than ours. The silence in the texts, the gaps where information should be, the fragmentary references that hint at more than they explain, all of this constitutes a kind of negative space that scholars have learned to read, not for what it contains but for what it implies, for the shape of what is missing, for the outline of a story that was once known but has been lost to time and decay and the sheer weight of millennia pressing down on clay tablets until they crumble into illegible fragments. And what the negative space implies is consistent across multiple independent texts. There was something before us, there was an earlier attempt, there was a version that failed and had to be revised, and the humans who now walk the earth carrying the blood of slain gods in their veins are not the first beings to serve that function, but the replacement for something that came before and proved unsuitable. The scholarly consensus treats these hints with appropriate caution, recognizing that fragmentary evidence can be overinterpreted, that patterns can be imposed on random survivals, that the desire to find a coherent narrative can lead researchers to connect dots that were never meant to form a picture. But even the cautious scholars acknowledge that the Mesopotamian creation traditions do not describe humanity as a singular perfect creation. They describe us as a solution, as a response, as the answer to a problem that could not be solved any other way. And if we were a solution, then there was a problem. And if the problem was the failure of an earlier system, then that system existed. And if that system involved beings who performed the labour we now perform, then those beings existed too somewhere in the before time, somewhere in the gaps the texts no longer fill, somewhere in the silence that the clay tablets can no longer break. If humanity was version 2, designed to replace divine labourers who had rebelled and improved after the flood to correct the flaws that made us too noisy, then what was version 1? What walked the earth before we did? What carried divine blood and performed cosmic labour and proved so problematic that the gods decided to start over with a new design? What beings does the silence remember even when the words have been lost, Goons? And where did they go when we arrived to take their place? The creation of humanity in Mesopotamian tradition was not a single act, but a process, not a moment of divine inspiration, but a sequence of attempts, and the texts that preserve this memory describe the mother goddess Nintu, also called Ninhursag or Mami or Belet Ili, depending on which tradition and which era produced the tablet. This goddess did not shape one human and declare her work complete. She shaped many. She experimented. She produced beings that varied in their capacities and their forms and their fitness for the purpose they were designed to serve, and some of these beings were set aside, placed into roles that accommodated their limitations, absorbed into the cosmic order as something other than the fully functional workers the gods required. The Sumerian text known to scholars as Enki and Ninmah, preserved on tablets dating to approximately 1600 BC, but recording traditions far older, describes a scene that has puzzled interpreters for over a century: the god Enki and the mother goddess engaging in what appears to be a creative contest, each shaping beings from clay and challenging the other to find a place for them in the world. And the beings they create are not the capable workers described in the Atrahasis, but figures marked by what we might call disability or deformity, beings who cannot hold urine, beings who cannot eat, beings whose hands do not grasp, beings whose eyes do not see, and for each imperfect creation Enki devises a role, a position in society where the limitation becomes irrelevant or even advantageous. And scholars have traditionally read this text as an origin myth for human disability, an explanation for why some people are born with conditions that prevent them from performing standard labour, a divine assignment of worth to those society might otherwise dismiss. But there is another way to read this text, one that fits the pattern, emerging from the Atrahasis and the Eridugenesis, and the scattered fragments preserved across museum collections, a reading that sees Enki and Ninmah not creating disabled humans but creating prototype humans, early attempts at the design that would eventually become viable, experiments that failed to meet specifications and had to be accommodated rather than discarded. And if this reading is correct, then the text preserves memory of an iterative creation process, of trial and error at the most fundamental level, of the gods themselves uncertain how to manufacture beings that would serve their purposes and working through multiple versions before achieving success. The 7 and 7 pattern appears in several Mesopotamian creation accounts, Nintu shaping 14 pieces of clay, 7 that would become male, and 7 that would become female, setting them in pairs, producing humanity not as individuals but as a batch. And this number 14 recurs with a frequency that suggests intentionality, 7 pairs, 7 attempts on each side, a structure that implies repetition rather than singular action. And if the goddess shaped 7 males and 7 females in the successful creation, how many did she shape in the unsuccessful ones? How many prototypes preceded the production run? How many beings emerged from her hands only to be found wanting and set aside for whatever came next? The concept of the Umul appears in fragmentary form across multiple texts, a category of being whose name derives from roots suggesting something malformed or monstrous or incomplete, creatures that lack proper form or function, that exist outside the categories of viable life, and scholars have struggled to determine exactly what the Umul were, whether they represent demons or monsters or mythological beasts or something else entirely. But one interpretation that fits the available evidence suggests they were the failed experiments, the prototypes that did not work, the beings shaped by divine hands but lacking whatever essential quality would allow them to serve the purpose for which humanity was designed. And if this interpretation holds, then the Umul are not creatures from another category, but creatures from an earlier version of our own category, beings who share our origin in divine clay and divine blood, but who emerged wrong, who could not do what needed to be done, who were set aside when the viable version finally appeared. The Yale Babylonian collection tablet, known as YBC 7167, contains a fragmentary text that describes divine deliberation about the nature of human beings, the gods expressing dissatisfaction with aspects of the creation, discussing modifications that might improve the design, and while the damage to the tablet makes complete interpretation impossible, the surviving portions confirm that Mesopotamian tradition imagined the gods as unsatisfied with their initial work, as recognizing flaws that required correction, as engaged in ongoing evaluation of whether the beings they had created met the specifications originally established. And this ongoing evaluation suggests that creation was not finished when the first humans emerged from Nintu's hands. It continued through assessment and modification, and perhaps through replacement of versions that failed to perform adequately. The mother goddess Ninhursag occupies a position in Mesopotamian tradition that parallels figures from cultures around the world, the divine feminine as source of life, as shaper of physical form, as the power that takes raw material and transforms it into living beings. But Ninhursag's role in the creation narratives carries specific implications that distinguish her from simpler fertility goddesses. She is not merely the source of birth, but the designer of form, the one who determines what shape life will take, what capacities it will possess, what limitations will constrain its function, and if she is the designer, then the variations in her designs become significant. The imperfect beings described in Enki and Ninmah represent not accidents but experiments, deliberate variations in the design process as the goddess worked toward a viable product. The blood of the slain god Geshtu-i, which the Atrahasis describes as the animating essence mixed into the clay of human creation, carried intelligence and spirit and the capacity for complex thought, but it also carried something else that the texts hint at without fully explaining, an etemmu, a spiritual component that would survive physical death and descend to the underworld. And this etemmu raises questions about the earlier prototypes. Did they also possess spiritual components? Did they also have something that survived their physical failure? Did the beings who were set aside when humanity emerged still exist in some form? Shadows of the first attempt haunting the edges of the cosmic order, not quite alive and not quite dead, but persisting in whatever state beings occupy when their bodies have been discarded, but their spirits have not been properly released. The parallel with other cultural traditions becomes impossible to ignore at this point. The Greek titans who ruled before the Olympian gods and were overthrown and imprisoned in Tartarus, the Hindu asuras who warred with the devas for supremacy and were defeated and consigned to lower realms, the Norse Jotun or giants who preceded the current order and were pushed to the margins of existence. the biblical Nephilim, who appear briefly in Genesis as beings born from the union of divine and human, and who were destroyed in the flood. And in each of these traditions the pattern is the same. Beings existed before the current order, they possessed power or knowledge or capacities that the later beings would lack. They proved problematic in ways that required their removal from the world. And the world as we know it emerged only after they were gone. The Nephilim deserve particular attention because the biblical account, though brief and fragmentary, preserves elements that parallel the Mesopotamian material with striking precision. The sons of God saw that the daughters of men were fair, and took wives from among them, and the children of these unions were mighty men of old, men of renown, beings who combined divine and human nature in ways that the text treats as problematic. And immediately after describing the Nephilim, the Genesis narrative transitions to the flood, the destruction that would wipe the earth clean of all but Noah and his family, and this juxtaposition implies causation. The Nephilim were part of what went wrong, part of what required the reset, part of whatever made the pre-flood world unsuitable for continuation. The Mesopotamian and biblical flood narratives share so many specific details that scholars have long recognized their common origin, Utnapishtim and Noah, both receiving divine warning, both building boats to precise specifications, both loading animals in pairs, both sending out birds to find dry land, both offering sacrifice when the waters recede. And if the flood narratives share common origin, then perhaps the accounts of what came before the flood also share common origin. Perhaps the Nephilim and the pre-flood humans of the Atrahasis, and the Umul, and the failed prototypes of Enki and Ninmah are all partial memories of the same thing. Beings who existed in an earlier age and proved unsuitable and were destroyed to make way for what exists now. The Asuras of Hindu tradition present an interesting variation on this pattern, because they are not simply destroyed or removed, but persist as an opposing force, beings of power and sometimes wisdom who continually challenge the divine order, who must be repeatedly defeated because they cannot be permanently eliminated. And this suggests a different model of what happens to failed versions of creation. Not annihilation, but transformation. Not removal, but reassignment. The earlier beings continuing to exist in some capacity, even as the newer beings take their place. And if this model applies to the Mesopotamian material, then the Umul and the failed prototypes may not have vanished entirely. They may persist in some realm or some form, shadows of the first attempt that the current creation has not entirely replaced. The Greek tradition offers perhaps the most detailed account of what happens when earlier beings are displaced. The Titans ruled during a golden age before the Olympian gods emerged to challenge their supremacy. Zeus and his siblings warred against Kronos and the Elder Titans. The conflict was cosmic in scale and resulted in the Titans being cast down into Tartarus, the deepest pit beneath the underworld, bound in chains, removed from the world but not destroyed, still existing in their prison, still possessing their power, still theoretically capable of returning if the bonds were ever broken. And this image of imprisoned predecessors, beings who ruled before and were overthrown but not killed, haunts the Greek imagination in ways that parallel the unease preserved in Mesopotamian creation accounts. The Enki and Ninmah text describes the goddess becoming drunk during the creation process, the beer flowing freely as she shapes being after being, and this detail has been read as comic relief, as humanizing the divine, as explaining imperfection through intoxication, but it can also be read as describing the experimental nature of the process, the willingness to try variations, the freedom that comes when precision is suspended and improvisation takes over. And if Ninmah was experimenting, then the failures were not accidents, but necessary steps in the process, each imperfect being teaching her something about what would and would not work, each Umul bringing her closer to the viable design that would eventually emerge as humanity. The fragmentary nature of the surviving texts means that we cannot reconstruct the complete history the ancient scribes once knew. We have pieces of a larger picture, shards of a broken mirror that once reflected a coherent image, and scholars spend careers attempting to fit these pieces together, to determine what connects to what, to trace the outlines of traditions that were once alive and continuous but now survive only in scattered fragments. And what the fragments consistently suggest is that creation was not simple, creation was not singular, creation was not a moment of divine perfection producing beings exactly suited to their purpose, but rather a process of development, of trial and error, of failure and correction, of beings produced and found wanting and set aside before the beings we recognize as ourselves could finally emerge. The weight of this evidence, accumulating across multiple texts from multiple periods and multiple cities, begins to form a picture that the individual fragments cannot convey, a pattern that becomes visible only when the pieces are laid side by side and their common elements recognized. And the pattern is this: the Mesopotamians remembered creation as iterative. They remembered beings who came before. They remembered failure as part of the process. They remembered the gods themselves as uncertain and experimental and working toward a solution rather than implementing a predetermined plan. And this memory, preserved in clay and surviving millennia of burial and excavation and translation, challenges the assumption that ancient peoples imagined creation as simple and perfect and complete. The beings who failed, the prototypes who were set aside, the Umul who lacked proper form, the creations of Enki and Ninmah who could not function as workers, these figures haunt the margins of the Mesopotamian textual tradition, never quite explained but never quite forgotten, and their presence implies a question the texts do not directly answer. Where did they go? What happened to beings who carried divine blood and spirit but lacked the capacities to serve divine purpose? Were they destroyed or transformed or simply pushed aside? Do they persist in some realm the texts barely acknowledge? Are they the source of the shadows and demons and malevolent spirits that populate Mesopotamian cosmology? Remnants of the first attempt that the second attempt has not entirely replaced. The mother goddess shapes clay, the father god provides blood, the spirit is bound into the physical form, and the being that emerges is alive, aware, capable of labor and reproduction and all the functions the gods require. But this being is not the first. This being is the latest. This being inherits a position that earlier beings once occupied and failed to maintain, and the weight of that inheritance, the knowledge that we are not original but replacement, not first but revised, not the initial vision but the corrected version, this weight settles into the narrative with the slow patience of sediment settling into archaeological layers, forming a stratum that separates what came before from what exists now, a boundary that the texts remember even when they cannot fully describe what lies on the other side. The Akkadian word rigmu appears repeatedly in the Atrahasis epic as the primary justification for divine intervention against humanity, and translators have rendered it variously as noise, clamour, uproar, tumult or disturbance. But none of these English words fully captures what the ancient scribes meant when they describe the gods growing intolerant of human rigmu, because the term carries meanings that extend far beyond mere sound into the realm of systemic disruption, of chaos threatening order, of activity that exceeds acceptable parameters and destabilizes the structures designed to contain it. And when Enlil complains that he cannot sleep because of the rigmu rising from the human population below, he is not describing the literal sound of voices or labor or even warfare. He is describing something that has grown beyond what the cosmic system can accommodate, a presence that has become too large, too active, too demanding of resources that were allocated for different purposes. The text is precise about the timeline. 1200 years pass after the creation of humanity, 1200 years during which the manufactured workforce performs its assigned function, maintaining the irrigation channels and agricultural systems the Agigi had abandoned, reproducing as designed, spreading across the available territory, and then something shifts. The population reaches a threshold that the text treats as significant, the land becomes filled with people, and the rigmu that rises from this filled land becomes unbearable to at least one member of the Divine Council. Enlil, chief administrator of cosmic order, finds himself unable to rest because of what humanity has become. The complaint Enlil brings to the Divine Assembly has been interpreted in multiple ways by scholars attempting to understand what the ancient scribes meant to convey. Some read it literally, suggesting that the noise of human civilization, the sounds of cities and markets and temples, and the endless activity of a species that cannot remain still actually disturbed divine sleep in some physical sense. Others read it metaphorically, suggesting that noise represents the burden of managing a population that has outgrown the systems designed to contain it, the administrative weight of governing beings who reproduce faster than they can be organized. Still others read it symbolically, suggesting that noise represents the challenge human consciousness poses to divine authority, the questioning, the demanding, the failure to simply obey and be silent, and the text itself supports all of these readings without definitively endorsing any of them, preserving the ambiguity that millennia of transmission have only deepened. What is clear from the text is that Enlil treats the noise problem as requiring solution rather than tolerance, He does not propose adapting the divine order to accommodate human expansion. He does not suggest that the gods learn to live with the disturbance. He does not consider that the system itself might be redesigned to incorporate, rather than resist what humanity has become. Instead, he proposes reduction, elimination, correction, and the other gods, after some deliberation, authorize him to proceed with corrective measures that will bring the human population back within acceptable parameters. And this authorization sets in motion a sequence of interventions that the text describes with the clinical precision of administrative documentation, each intervention designed to reduce human numbers, each intervention failing to achieve its intended purpose, each failure leading to escalation toward the ultimate solution. The first corrective measure was plague, disease sent among the human population to reduce their numbers through illness and death. And the text describes this not as punishment for moral failure, but as population control, as the kind of intervention a governing body might implement when a species under its management has exceeded a carrying capacity. And for a time the plague works, human numbers decline, the rigma subsides. Enlil finds relief from the disturbance that had been preventing his rest. But then something happens that the divine planners apparently did not anticipate. The god Enki, who had designed humanity in the first place and who seems to feel some responsibility for his creation, intervenes on behalf of the humans, instructing them to focus their worship and offerings on Namtar, the plague god, appeasing the deity responsible for the disease and thereby ending the epidemic. And when the plague ends, the human population rebounds, reproduction resuming its exponential expansion, the rigmu returning to levels as intolerable as before. The second corrective measure was drought, the gods withholding rain from the earth, drying up the sources of water that human agriculture depended on, creating conditions of scarcity that would reduce population through thirst and failed crops. And again the text describes this without moral framing, without suggesting that humans deserve to suffer, without claiming that the drought was punishment for wickedness. It was simply the next tool in the administrative toolkit, the next attempt to solve a management problem that the first solution had failed to permanently address. And again the intervention worked initially. Human numbers declined, suffering spread, the rigma subsided, Enlil found temporary relief, but again Enki intervened, instructing humans to focus their worship on Adad, the storm god, the deity who controlled rainfall. And when Adad was properly appeased, the rains returned, the crops grew, the population recovered, and the cycle continued. The third corrective measure was famine, the gods cutting off all sources of food, allowing neither rain nor flood to bring fertility to the fields, creating conditions so severe that the text describes humans resorting to cannibalism, parents eating their children, the fundamental bonds of family dissolving under the pressure of starvation. And this measure persisted longer than the previous two. The text specifies 6 years of intensifying deprivation, 6 years during which humanity was ground down toward extinction, and yet even this was not sufficient. Even this failed to permanently solve the problem Enlil had identified, because Enki again found a way to intervene, providing fish from the sea, maintaining just enough human survival to allow the species to persist through the crisis. And when conditions eventually normalized, the population again expanded, again filled the land, again raised the rigmu to intolerable levels, and Enlil found himself back where he had started, facing a problem that 3 major interventions had failed to permanently resolve. The pattern here deserves careful attention because it reveals something about how the ancient scribes understood the nature of governance and the limits of control. Each intervention succeeded temporarily, each reduced the problem to acceptable levels, each provided relief for the administrative structure that could not accommodate unlimited expansion. But each was reversed when the conditions that had caused the population to grow in the first place were allowed to resume. The fundamental dynamics of human reproduction and expansion remained unchanged. The interventions addressed symptoms rather than causes, and the population always rebounded because nothing in the system had been modified to prevent rebounding. The humans were still designed to multiply, still driven to expand, still equipped with the capacities that had caused the noise problem in the first place, and until those capacities were addressed, the problem would continue recurring no matter how severe the corrective measures became. The flood, when it finally came, represented not simply the most extreme corrective measure, but a fundamentally different approach to the problem. Not population reduction, but population elimination. Not temporary intervention, but permanent reset. The gods, authorizing total destruction of humanity with the intention of starting over, of wiping the experimental failure clean and beginning again with new parameters. And if Enki had not intervened one final time, warning the human Atrahasis to build a boat and preserve a seed of the species through the deluge, humanity as the Mesopotamians understood it would have ended entirely, replaced perhaps by a third attempt, a version 3 that might have been designed with the constraints necessary to prevent the noise problem from recurring. But Enki did intervene. Atrahasis did survive. And when the floodwaters receded and the lone surviving human emerged to offer sacrifice, the gods faced a choice they had not anticipated. The sweet smell of burnt offerings reminded them what they had lost. The labour force was gone, the channels would silt up, the fields would go untended, the cosmic infrastructure would decay without workers to maintain it, and in this moment of divine regret the text describes something crucial, a renegotiation of the terms of human existence. New limitations imposed not through external intervention, but through modification of human nature itself, constraints built into the post-flood version of humanity that the pre-flood version had lacked. The post-flood limitations described in the Atrahasis and related texts represent a fundamental redesign of human biology and society. Women who would be unable to bear children, either through biological infertility or through social roles that prohibited reproduction. Demons who would snatch infants from their mothers, preventing the young from surviving to adulthood. Categories of early death that would limit how long humans could live, and therefore how many descendants they could produce. And these limitations were not punishments for the noise that had preceded the flood, they were engineering solutions, design modifications intended to address the flaw that had caused the system to fail. If humans were going to be allowed to continue existing, then they would need to be constrained in ways that prevented unlimited expansion. The pre-flood model was unworkable. The post-flood model would incorporate the lessons learned from that failure. The Sumerian King List, that extraordinary document which records rulers from before and after the flood, demonstrates the implementation of these design modifications through the mathematical precision of its reign lengths. Pre-flood kings ruled for tens of thousands of years, Alulim for 28,800 years, Alalgar for 36,000 years, Enmenloana for 43,200 years, and these impossible durations suggest beings whose lifespans were not constrained in the way post-flood lifespans would be. After the flood, the numbers immediately drop, kings ruling for hundreds of years rather than tens of thousands, and then continuing to decrease through successive dynasties until reaching the mortal spans we recognize from verified historical records. And this decline was not accidental. It was designed, a graduated reduction in human longevity that would limit reproduction, limit accumulation, limit the noise that had made the pre-flood world unbearable. The Rigmu problem, viewed through this lens, was essentially a design flaw in the original human model. The beings created to replace the rebellious Igigi were too successful, they reproduced too efficiently, they expanded too readily, they filled the available space too quickly, and the system, designed to accommodate a workforce, had not included provisions for what would happen when that workforce exceeded the capacity of the system to manage it. The gods had created a labour force without building in the constraints that would keep the labour force within sustainable bounds, and the flood was not punishment for this design flaw, but correction of it. The reset that would allow version 2 to replace version 1, the patch that would address the bug that had crashed the original system. The clinical tone of the original text supports this interpretation. The Atrahasis does not describe Enlil raging against human wickedness, does not portray the flood as moral judgment, does not suggest that humans had sinned and deserved destruction. It describes an administrative problem and a series of administrative solutions, each solution evaluated for effectiveness, each failure leading to escalation, the final solution implemented only when all lesser measures had proven inadequate. And this administrative framing distinguishes the Mesopotamian flood narrative from later versions that would moralize the story, transforming population control into divine wrath, transforming design correction into punishment for sin, transforming a governance failure into a moral tale about the consequences of human wickedness. The Noah story in Genesis preserves the structure of the Mesopotamian original but changes its meaning. Fundamentally, the flood comes because humanity has become wicked, because violence fills the earth, because every thought of the human heart is only evil continually, and this moral framing serves theological purposes that the Mesopotamian original did not share. It explains suffering as deserved, it justifies destruction as righteous, It makes the flood a lesson in divine justice rather than a case study in population management. But the older version, the version pressed into clay tablets centuries before Genesis was composed, tells a different story. A story about systems and their limits, about creation and its flaws, about the gods themselves uncertain how to manage what they had made and resorting to increasingly drastic measures when their management failed. The phrase Rigmu echoes through the narrative like a technical term, like the designation for a specific category of system failure. And when modern readers encounter it, they should hear not simply noise but disruption, not simply sound but the pressure of presence, not simply clamour but the weight of a species that has outgrown its container. Because that is what the ancient scribes meant to convey. They were describing the moment when created beings exceeded the parameters of their creation. When the workforce became larger than the system designed to utilise it, when the gods discovered that solving one problem had created another, and the solution they eventually implemented, the flood followed by biological redesign, was not an expression of anger, but an acknowledgement of error. The recognition that creation requires ongoing correction, that even divine design contains flaws that only become apparent when systems operate long enough for their limitations to emerge. The post-flood humans inherited a world shaped by this correction. We live with shortened lifespans because the pre-flood lifespans produced too many generations. We experience limits on fertility because unlimited fertility filled the Earth too quickly. We carry in our biology the engineering solutions to problems our predecessors created and could not solve. And the texts remember this not as tragedy but as fact, not as fall from grace but as modification of specification, the administrative documentation of how a flawed design was identified, addressed, and replaced with something the gods hoped would prove more sustainable. And whether their hope was justified, whether the noise has truly been controlled or merely postponed, whether the corrected version of humanity has solved the problem or only delayed its recurrence, these are questions the texts leave for subsequent generations to answer through the evidence of their own experience. When the floodwaters receded, and Atrahasis emerged from his boat onto a world scoured clean of everything that had lived before, when he built an altar and offered sacrifice and the gods gathered to smell the sweet savour rising from burnt offerings, something fundamental shifted in the relationship between divine and human, something the texts describe with the same administrative precision they apply to everything else: the negotiation of new terms, the establishment of new parameters, the implementation of design modifications that would distinguish post-flood humanity from everything that had come before. And these modifications were not minor adjustments or cosmetic changes, but fundamental alterations to what human beings were, how long they could live, how readily they could reproduce, how close they could come to the divine realm that had created and then nearly destroyed them. The Atrahasis epic describes this moment of renegotiation as a covenant. Though that word carries theological weight, the original text does not quite support. It was less a sacred agreement between equal parties than a new set of specifications imposed by manufacturers who had learned from the failure of their first product. The gods had created beings without sufficient constraints, and those beings had filled the earth with Rigmu until the system could not sustain them. Now the gods would create constraints, would build limitations into the very nature of human existence, would ensure that the noise problem could never occur by making it biologically and socially impossible for humanity to expand beyond manageable bounds. The first and most fundamental modification was mortality itself. The pre-flood humans, according to the reign lengths preserved in the Sumerian King List, could live for tens of thousands of years, Alulim ruling for 28,800 years, his successors for similarly impossible durations, and whether these numbers represent literal lifespans or symbolic ages, or something we no longer have the context to interpret correctly, they indicate that the pre-flood condition was radically different from what came after. The post-flood kings immediately show reduced reign lengths, still impossibly long by our standards, but a fraction of what preceded them, and this reduction continues systematically through successive dynasties until reaching the mortal spans we recognise from verified historical records: 40 years, 30 years, 15 years. The gradual implementation of a design change that would limit how long any individual human could live, and therefore how much impact any individual could have on the world. The Epic of Gilgamesh, that masterpiece of ancient literature preserved on tablets found in the ruins of Nineveh, takes this mortality as its central theme and transforms what the Atrahasis presents as engineering solution into existential tragedy. Gilgamesh is 2/3 divine and 1/3 human, a being of extraordinary power and accomplishment who nonetheless cannot escape the death that claims all mortals, and when his companion Enkidu dies, Gilgamesh is shattered by the realization that he too will perish, that all his achievements will end in the same silence that has swallowed his friend, and so he sets out on a quest for immortality, seeking the secret that will allow him to transcend the limitation built into post-flood humanity, and his quest takes him to the edges of the world through mountains of darkness, across the waters of death, to the island where Utnapishtim lives, the flood survivor who alone among humans was granted eternal life. The encounter between Gilgamesh and Utnapishtim, preserved on the 11th tablet of the epic, constitutes the definitive statement on why mortality cannot be reversed, cannot be escaped, cannot be overcome by any human effort. No matter how heroic, Utnapishtim tells Gilgamesh the story of the flood, explains how he alone was warned and survived, describes the moment when the gods granted him immortality as a unique exception never to be repeated, and then he challenges Gilgamesh to demonstrate his fitness for eternal life by staying awake for 6 days and 7 nights, a test Gilgamesh immediately fails, falling asleep. As soon as the challenge begins, and this failure proves the point Utnapishtim is making, humans are not built for immortality. Sleep is a small death that claims us every day. We cannot resist even this temporary cessation of consciousness. How could we possibly resist the permanent cessation that comes at the end of life? The plant of rejuvenation that Gilgamesh retrieves from the ocean floor, the final hope that might allow him to cheat death by restoring youth whenever old age approaches, this plant is stolen by a serpent while Gilgamesh bathes, the snake consuming the treasure and shedding its skin and slithering away renewed, while the hero watches helplessly. And this loss is not accidental or unfortunate, but inevitable, the narrative insisting that mortality cannot be circumvented, that the design modification implemented after the flood is permanent and irreversible, that humanity must accept the limitation or be destroyed by the refusal to accept it, and Gilgamesh returns to Uruk empty-handed, showing his companion the walls of the city, the only immortality available to mortals, the endurance of works rather than the endurance of workers, legacy rather than longevity, memory rather than continued presence. The second category of modification described in the post-flood texts involves reproduction itself, the capacity that had allowed pre-flood humanity to fill the earth with rigmu, now constrained through multiple mechanisms, women who would be unable to bear children either through biological infertility or through social roles that prohibited reproduction, priestesses consecrated to celibacy, categories of women set apart from the reproductive cycle, and the text does not present these as misfortunes befalling individuals, but as features of the redesigned system, deliberate limitations on the fertility that had proved so problematic in the pre-flood age. Infant mortality appears in the texts as another such mechanism, demons who snatch babies from their mothers, the Lammastu who preys on newborns, the forces that prevent the young from surviving to adulthood, and modern readers tend to interpret these as mythological explanations for the tragedy of child death, ways ancient peoples made sense of suffering that seemed random and cruel, but the Atrahasis presents them differently, as designed features of the post-flood world, constraints implemented specifically to limit population growth, and if this interpretation is correct, then the deaths of children are not divine punishment or demonic malevolence but engineering specifications, the gods ensuring that not all who are born will survive to reproduce, building failure into the system at the most fundamental level. Miscarriage appears in the same context, pregnancies that do not come to term, potential lives that never manifest, and again the text presents this not as tragedy but as mechanism. Another way the post-flood design limits the reproduction that had grown so problematic in the pre-flood age, and the cumulative effect of these modifications, shortened lifespans combined with reduced fertility, combined with infant mortality, combined with miscarriage, combined with categories of women who do not bear children, produces a human population that cannot expand without limit, that is held in check by constraints built into its very nature, that will never again fill the earth with the rigmu that disturbed Enlil's sleep and triggered the catastrophic intervention of the flood. The Sumerian King List encodes this diminishment with mathematical precision, the reign length serving as a kind of graph that tracks the decline from pre-flood immortality to post-flood mortality. And scholars have noted that the numbers are not random but follow patterns that suggest deliberate construction, multiples of 60 reflecting the Mesopotamian sexagesimal mathematical system, systematic decreases that trace a curve from the impossible to the historical, and whether the scribes, who compiled the list, understood these numbers as literal reign lengths or symbolic encodings of a deeper truth about the changing nature of human existence. They preserved a record that documents the transition from one kind of humanity to another, the replacement of the unlimited by the limited, the constrained version that would prove sustainable in ways the unconstrained version had not. The divine withdrawal that accompanies these modifications represents perhaps the most significant change in the post-flood order. The gods who had walked among cities and governed directly through presence now receding into the background, communicating through omens and dreams rather than face-to-face instruction, operating through priests and rituals rather than immediate intervention. And this withdrawal was not abandonment in the sense of departure, but repositioning in the sense of management from a distance. The gods remaining involved in human affairs but no longer entangled in them, no longer responsible for the day-to-day administration of civilizations that were now expected to govern themselves. The pre-flood world, as the texts describe it, was a world of divine presence, the Anunnaki actively administering their assigned domains, Enki governing fresh water and wisdom, Enlil governing air and authority, Ninhursag governing birth and the shaping of life, each deity functioning as something like a portfolio minister with direct responsibility for specific aspects of cosmic order, and humans in this world were workers rather than citizens, performing assigned tasks under divine supervision, not expected to govern themselves because governance was the gods' domain. But the post-flood world operated differently, kingship descending from heaven, but then remaining on earth, human rulers claiming divine sanction, but exercising actual authority, the gods legitimizing rather than directly ruling, endorsing rather than commanding, and this shift from governance to legitimization changed everything about how civilization functioned and how humans understood their place within it. The phrase kingship descended from heaven appears at the beginning of the Sumerian King List and at the resumption of kingship after the flood, and this phrase has been interpreted in multiple ways, as description of divine appointment, as claim to cosmic authority, as explanation for why some rule and others obey, but in the context of the post-flood modifications it carries specific meaning. Kingship was no longer held by gods but by humans. The office had been transferred, the function had been delegated, and while the gods retained ultimate authority and could theoretically intervene at any moment, in practice they did not. In practice they receded into temple cults and ritual observances and the interpretation of omens, leaving humans to manage the world the gods had redesigned, but no longer wished to directly administer. The temples that dominated ancient Mesopotamian cities were not merely places of worship, but interfaces between the divine and human realms, sites where the reduced connection between gods and humanity was carefully maintained through offerings and rituals and the service of priests who specialized in interpreting divine will, and the elaborate nature of these institutions, the resources devoted to them, the centrality they occupied in urban life, reflects the difficulty of maintaining relationship with deities who were no longer present in the way they had once been. The gods had withdrawn but not disappeared. They still mattered, they still influenced events, they still required acknowledgement and appeasement. But they no longer walked among the people they had created. They communicated through intermediaries, through signs that required expert interpretation, through dreams that might or might not carry authentic divine messages. And this mediated relationship became the norm, the conditions of post-flood existence, the way things were for humans who had been redesigned to require less supervision and receive less presence. The introduction of mortality as a designed feature rather than a punishment or a flaw represents perhaps the most profound theological shift in the post-flood order. The pre-flood beings were not immortal in the sense of being guaranteed eternal existence, but they were durable in ways post-flood humans are not. They could persist for tens of thousands of years. They did not face the constant pressure of time running out. They could accumulate experience and power and influence across epochs rather than decades, and the reduction of this durability to mortal spans was not a fall from grace, but an engineering decision. The gods determining that beings who lived too long produced too much noise, that sustainability required limitation, that the system could only function if its components were regularly replaced rather than indefinitely maintained. The Gilgamesh epic transforms this engineering decision into existential insight, presenting mortality not as design flaw to be corrected, but as design feature to be accepted. And Gilgamesh's failure to achieve immortality is not tragedy in the sense of loss, but education in the sense of learning. He returns to Uruk having learned what humans are, having accepted the limitation built into his nature, having found meaning not in transcending his condition, but in working within it, and the walls of the city that he shows his companion at the epic's end are proof that mortal beings can still create lasting value, that constraint does not preclude accomplishment, that the design modifications do not reduce humans to insignificance but focus human effort toward achievable ends. The second creation, the post-flood humanity, was designed to be sustainable in ways the first creation was not, built with limitations that would prevent the noise problem from recurring, constructed to live shorter lives and reproduce less, readily and die more frequently, and these limitations were features not bugs, specifications not accidents, the result of divine learning from divine failure, and the humans who inherited this design were not inferior to their predecessors, but differently calibrated, optimized for a world the gods intended to administer from a distance rather than govern through presence. And whether this optimization was kindness or cruelty, gift or punishment, liberation or constraint, the texts do not say. They simply record the modifications and leave later generations to interpret what it means to exist as beings deliberately designed to be less than the beings who came before, to carry within our biology the corrections implemented by gods who had learned from their mistakes and did not intend to make those mistakes again, and the silence of the divine realm, the distance between heaven and earth, the difficulty of hearing what the gods once spoke clearly, all of this is part of the design. All of this is specification. All of this is what we were made to experience when we were made the second time. In 1929, British archaeologist Leonard Woolley was excavating the royal cemetery at Ur in southern Iraq when his workers struck something unexpected beneath the tombs. A layer of clean water deposited silt 11 feet thick, sterile and uniform, containing no pottery shards, no ash, no bone fragments, no evidence whatsoever of human habitation. And when Woolley ordered his team to dig through this barren stratum, they found beneath it the ruins of an earlier settlement, collapsed mud brick walls, fragments of painted pottery in styles that had vanished from the archaeological record. The remains of a world that had been abruptly buried beneath sediment carried by massive water flow, and Woolley, recognizing the significance of what he had uncovered, reportedly telegraphed the British Museum with a message that would make international headlines: "We have found the flood." The layer Woolley discovered at Ur was not unique. Similar deposits have been identified at multiple sites across southern Mesopotamia. At Kish, a flood layer 18 inches thick was found dating to approximately the same period. At Shurapak, the city where, according to the Mesopotamian text, the flood hero ruled as king before the deluge, excavators found evidence of violent inundation interrupting occupation around 2900 BC. At Uruk, stratigraphic analysis revealed discontinuities in settlement patterns coinciding with widespread flooding across the region. And while no single flood layer extends continuously across all sites, while the deposits vary in thickness and precise dating, the cumulative evidence confirms that catastrophic flooding did occur in southern Mesopotamia during the late 4th and early 3rd millennium BC. Not a global deluge, but regional disasters, severe enough to bury cities and interrupt the continuity of civilization. The physical reality of flooding in ancient Mesopotamia should not surprise anyone familiar with the geography of the region. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers were unpredictable, their annual floods varying dramatically in timing and intensity. The flat alluvial plain between them offered no natural barriers to floodwaters that could spread across miles of territory. Early cities were built on this plain because the soil was fertile and water was available for irrigation, but those same conditions made them vulnerable to inundation when the rivers exceeded their normal bounds, and the archaeological record preserves multiple flood events across the millennia of Mesopotamian civilization. Some localized, some regional, all traumatic for the populations that experienced them. What makes Woolley's discovery and the related flood layers at other sites significant is not simply that flooding occurred, but what the deposits reveal about the transition between what came before and what came after. The material culture found beneath the flood layers at Ur differs in measurable ways from the material culture found above them. Pottery styles change, architectural practices shift, burial customs evolve, and while continuity exists, while the post-flood population clearly inherited knowledge and traditions from the pre-flood world, the transition marked by the flood layers represents a genuine discontinuity, a break in the pattern that the texts describe as the boundary between one age and another. The sudden civilization problem, as scholars have termed it, emerges from examination of sites like Uruk, where the archaeological record seems to show advanced urban development appearing without clear antecedents. Around 3500 BC, Uruk materialized in southern Mesopotamia as a city of extraordinary sophistication. Walls stretching for 6 miles constructed from millions of mud bricks. The White Temple rising on a platform 40 feet high, with its corners aligned to cardinal directions with surveyor-level precision. Cylinder, seals depicting complex iconography, administrative tablets recording grain distribution and labour assignments in a writing system already mature enough to handle abstract concepts, and all of this appearing in the archaeological record as if stepping out of shadow fully formed, with no clear developmental sequence leading up to it. No gradual evolution from village to town to city. No trial and error visible in the material remains. Samuel Noah Kramer, the Assyriologist who spent decades translating Sumerian tablets and studying Mesopotamian civilization, called Uruk history's first southern civilization, and the phrase itself reveals the discomfort scholars feel when confronting evidence that does not fit expected patterns of gradual development. Civilizations are supposed to evolve. Complexity is supposed to emerge from simplicity through incremental stages. Yet here was a city demonstrating sophisticated urban planning, monumental architecture, complex bureaucracy, and mature writing appearing without the long apprenticeship that developmental models would predict. And the various explanations proposed for this sudden appearance, including migration from elsewhere, accelerated development under specific environmental conditions, and gaps in the archaeological record that obscure earlier stages, none fully account for the scale and sophistication of what Uruk represents. The temple sequence at Eridu offers perhaps the most striking evidence of continuity across enormous spans of time. When Iraqi archaeologists excavated the site in the 1940s, they discovered 18 distinct occupation layers beneath the visible ruins, 18 temples built one atop another across nearly 3,000 years, the earliest dating to before 5000 BC. And remarkably, each temple followed the same basic architectural plan as its predecessors: a rectangular shrine with niches for offerings, an altar platform, a central hearth, the design maintained with such fidelity across millennia that later builders must have been deliberately replicating what earlier builders had established, treating the original pattern as sacred and unchangeable, not innovating but reproducing, not improving but preserving. The lowest temple at Eridu, designated Temple 16 by archaeologists, was small but architecturally sophisticated, already embodying the design principles that would persist through all subsequent rebuildings, and radiocarbon dating placed it around 5400 BC, making it older than the earliest dynasties recorded in the Sumerian King List, older than writing, older than the period the texts describe as the beginning of kingship. And yet the structure was not primitive. It demonstrated planning and proportion and orientation that suggest intentional design rather than organic development, as if the builders had arrived with a template already in mind, implementing a pattern that existed before they put it into physical form. The persistence of this template, across 18 iterations spanning thousands of years, raises questions about how knowledge was transmitted and maintained across such durations. Each temple was ritually buried beneath clean sand before the next was built atop it. Each new structure aligned precisely with the ruins below, each generation of builders treating the inherited design as authoritative and inviolable. And this pattern of preservation rather than innovation characterizes much of what we find in early Mesopotamian material culture. The sense that ancient peoples were not inventing but recovering, not creating but maintaining, not developing new forms, but carefully reproducing forms they believed had been established in an earlier age by authorities they could no longer directly access. The skeletal record from ancient Mesopotamia is fragmentary and difficult to interpret. Bones preserved poorly in the saline soils of southern Iraq. Many burials were disturbed by later construction or looting, and these techniques for extracting genetic information from ancient remains continue to develop. But what evidence exists suggests population discontinuities that might correspond to the textual accounts of catastrophic intervention. Studies of ancient DNA from broader Near Eastern populations have identified genetic bottlenecks, moments when effective population size dropped dramatically before recovering. And while attributing specific bottlenecks to specific events remains speculative, the genetic evidence confirms that human populations in the region did experience dramatic contractions that reduced diversity in ways still detectable in modern populations. The material culture found above flood layers at sites like Ur and Kish shows both continuity and change in proportions that scholars continue to debate. pottery traditions persist but evolve. Architectural techniques continue but with modifications. Burial practices show both inherited elements and new features that did not appear before the flood deposits, and this pattern of partial continuity suggests that the post-flood population maintained connection to pre-flood traditions while also introducing or developing elements that distinguished them from their predecessors, as if the survivors had preserved what they could of the old knowledge while adapting to new conditions or implementing new specifications that changed how they organized their lives. The irrigation systems that made Mesopotamian civilization possible present their own puzzles. The canals and channels that directed water from the rivers to the fields required sophisticated engineering knowledge, understanding of water flow, surveying capabilities, organizational capacity to mobilize labor and maintain infrastructure across generations, and the earliest such systems appear in the archaeological record without clear developmental sequences, already functional, already integrated into the agricultural economy, as if the knowledge required to build and operate them had arrived with the populations who used them, rather than developing gradually through local experimentation. And while scholars generally attribute this to the limitations of the archaeological record, to earlier phases that have not yet been discovered or have been destroyed by later activity, the absence of developmental sequences remains a puzzle that the sudden civilization framework struggles to fully explain. The ziggurats that would come to dominate Mesopotamian cityscapes evolved from the temple platforms visible at Eridu and other early sites, step structures rising in diminishing tiers toward the sky, and the precision of their construction, corners aligned to cardinal directions, proportions following mathematical ratios that appear consistently across sites and centuries, suggest builders working from established templates rather than improvising designs, following specifications that had been inherited from earlier sources, treating architecture as reproduction of sacred geometry rather than creative expression of individual or communal vision. And this approach to building, preservation rather than innovation, persists throughout Mesopotamian history, each generation understanding its task as maintaining what had been given rather than improving upon what had been inherited. The contrast between the sophistication visible at early Mesopotamian sites and the developmental sequences visible in other regions has led some scholars to propose that Mesopotamian civilization received a technological and organizational boost from elsewhere, perhaps from populations who migrated into the alluvial plain bringing knowledge developed in other environments, perhaps from trading connections that transmitted ideas and techniques across distances. And while these proposals remain speculative and contested, they acknowledge the central puzzle that the archaeological evidence presents: the appearance of complexity without clear, local antecedents. The emergence of civilization in forms that seem to presuppose knowledge the archaeological record cannot account for. The flood layers themselves, examined carefully, reveal information about the catastrophes they record. The silt at Ur was deposited by water flowing from the Euphrates rather than rainfall. The depth suggests sustained inundation rather than brief flooding. The sterile nature of the deposit indicates that no life survived in the affected area during the period of deposition, and the 11 feet of material accumulated in what Woolley estimated as a relatively brief period, perhaps a single catastrophic event, perhaps a series of floods occurring close enough together to form a continuous deposit, but in either case representing a disaster severe enough to bury settlements entirely and interrupt occupation for an extended period. The cities that emerged above the flood layers rebuilt on the same sites their predecessors had occupied, using the same sacred geography, maintaining the same orientation of temples and public spaces, treating the buried ruins beneath them as foundations rather than obstacles, and this continuity of place despite discontinuity of occupation suggests that something other than mere convenience drove the rebuilding. The sites were sacred, the locations were prescribed, the geometry of the cities was not arbitrary, but inherited from a template that survived the catastrophe even when the populations did not, and the rebuilders understood themselves as restorers rather than founders, continuing a pattern that had been interrupted but not destroyed. The archaeological evidence cannot prove that the textual accounts of creation and flood and divine intervention describe literal events. What it can do is demonstrate that the world the texts describe, a world of sudden sophistication and catastrophic flooding and meticulous preservation of inherited patterns, corresponds to physical remains that can be excavated and measured and dated. The texts are not pure fantasy projected onto an empty landscape, but interpretations of a real historical and geographical context. And whatever the ancient scribes meant when they described kingship descending from heaven, and humanity being created twice and the flood sweeping over the land, they were describing a world that the archaeological record confirms was marked by discontinuity and sudden development, and the patient reconstruction of patterns that predated the people who maintained them. A world in which the past was treated as authoritative precisely because the past was understood to contain something the present had lost and could only partially recover. Across the Pacific Ocean, from the alluvial plains of Mesopotamia in the highland forests of Guatemala, where the Quiché Maya preserved their sacred histories through centuries of colonial suppression, a text known as the Popol Vuh describes the creation of humanity in terms that echo the Mesopotamian pattern with uncanny precision, the gods attempting multiple times to fashion beings who could properly worship them and maintain the ceremonies that cosmic order required, each attempt failing for different reasons, each failure leading to destruction and revision, until finally the current version of humanity emerged from the divine workshop, not as the first draft but as the corrected edition, not as the original vision, but as what remained after earlier visions proved unworkable. The Popol Vuh describes the first attempt as beings made from mud, shapeless and dissolving, unable to hold their form or speak coherently or perform the worship the gods desired. And these mud people were allowed to disintegrate, their failure so complete that destruction required no active intervention. They simply fell apart, returning to the formlessness from which they had been shaped. And the gods considered what had gone wrong and determined to try again with different materials and different methods. The second attempt produced beings made from wood, carved figures that could walk and speak and reproduce, that filled the earth with their presence and their activity, and for a time the wooden people seemed successful. They multiplied. They built dwellings. They populated the world the gods had created. But something essential was missing. They had no hearts, no minds capable of remembering their creators, no capacity for the gratitude and worship that had motivated their creation, and the gods grew dissatisfied with beings who functioned but did not fulfill their purpose, who existed but did not acknowledge the existence of those who had made them. The destruction of the wooden people in the Popol Vuh mirrors the Mesopotamian flood in significant ways, a catastrophic intervention that wipes out the failed creation to make room for what will come next. Though the Quiché narrative includes elements absent from the Mesopotamian accounts, the wooden people's own tools, and animals turning against them, the grinding stones and cooking pots and dogs attacking their former masters in retribution for mistreatment, and the survivors of this destruction becoming the monkeys that still inhabit the forests, transformed rather than eliminated, pushed to the margins of existence rather than annihilated entirely. The successful creation in the Popol Vuh came from maize, the sacred grain that sustained Mesoamerican civilization, the gods grinding corn and mixing it with water to form the flesh of true humans, beings who could see and understand, who could worship properly, who could maintain the ceremonies that kept cosmic order functioning. And these maize people are the ancestors of the Quiché themselves, the current humanity that exists because earlier versions failed and were replaced. And this narrative of iterative creation, of trial and error at the divine level, of humanity as version 3 or version 4 rather than version 1, parallels the Mesopotamian pattern so closely that scholars have debated for generations whether some historical connection might explain the similarities. The Hindu Puranas, those vast encyclopedias of cosmic history compiled in India during the first millennium of the Common Era but preserving traditions far older, describe creation as cyclical rather than singular, the universe moving through immense epochs called yugas, each age characterized by different qualities and different kinds of beings, each age declining from the perfection that preceded it until dissolution comes and the cycle begins again. The Satya Yuga, the first age, lasted for over 1,700,000 years according to the traditional calculations, and during this age Dharma stood on 4 legs, righteousness was complete, beings lived in harmony with cosmic law, the gods walked among their creation and governance was direct and present, and the humans of this age, if humans is even the right word for being so, different from what we have become, possessed capacities and lifespans that dwarf anything the current age can imagine. They were what we might have been if decline had not been built into the structure of time itself. Each subsequent age sees reduction, the Treta Yuga bringing Dharma down to 3 legs, the Dvapara Yuga reducing it to 2, until the current age, the Kali Yuga, arrives with Dharma balanced precariously on a single leg, righteousness minimal, lifespan shortened, capacities diminished, the gods withdrawn to such distance that their presence can barely be detected. And the humans of this age, the age in which we now live according to Hindu tradition, are the weakest and most limited versions of humanity ever to exist, the degraded remnant of what was once far greater, the endpoint of a decline that began when time itself began. The parallels with the Mesopotamian pattern of declining reign lengths in the Sumerian King List are striking, both traditions encoding diminishment into their accounts of history, both remembering an earlier age when beings lived longer and possessed greater capacities, both treating the current state of humanity as fallen from something better, rather than evolved towards something higher. And while the Hindu framework is cyclical where the Mesopotamian seems linear, while the Puranas anticipate renewal after dissolution where the Mesopotamian texts do not, the shared sense that humanity has declined, that we are less than what came before, that the current age represents constraint rather than achievement, this shared sensibility crosses the geographical and cultural distance between ancient India and ancient Sumer. The Greek tradition, preserved by Hesiod in his Works and Days, composed around 700 BC, describes 5 ages of humanity in a sequence that emphasizes decline as clearly as anything in the Mesopotamian or Hindu materials. The Golden Age, when humans lived like gods without sorrow or toil, when the earth gave forth fruit without cultivation and death came like sleep without pain. The Silver Age, when humans were weaker and shorter lived and failed to honor the gods properly. The Bronze Age, when humans were fierce and warlike and destroyed themselves through violence. The Heroic Age, when the great figures of Greek mythology walked the earth. And finally the Iron Age, the current age, when labor is unceasing and suffering is constant and the gods have withdrawn to such distance that their favor can barely be secured. Hesiod did not invent this framework. He was preserving traditions that predated him, and the structure of decline from golden perfection to iron degradation appears in forms that suggest widespread currency in the ancient Mediterranean world, the sense that humanity had fallen from a better state, that the current condition represented loss rather than gain, that earlier ages had contained something the present age could no longer access. And this sense, shared across Greek and Mesopotamian and Indian traditions, points toward a common human experience that the mythological frameworks were attempting to articulate, the intuition that things were once different, that beings once existed who exceeded current parameters, that the world was once organized according to principles that no longer apply. The Norse Eddas, composed in medieval Iceland but preserving traditions from the pre-Christian Scandinavian world, describe creation in terms that include beings prior to humans, the giants or Jotnar who emerged from the primordial chaos before the gods themselves, who were older than the current order and remained in tension with it, who represented an earlier state of existence that the ordered cosmos had displaced but not eliminated. And these giants persist at the margins of the world, in the cold outer regions beyond the protective boundaries of Midgard where humans dwell, waiting perhaps for the Ragnarok when the current order will fall and something new will emerge from its ruins. The giant Ymir, whose body was dismembered by Odin and his brothers to create the physical world, represents a being who existed before creation as the Norse understood it, a predecessor whose destruction was necessary for the current order to emerge. And this pattern of earlier beings giving way to later ones, of the current world built from the remains of what came before, echoes the Mesopotamian accounts of gods slain to provide the animating essence for human creation. The sense that what exists now was purchased through the destruction of what existed previously. The biblical tradition, though shaped by the monotheistic framework that distinguishes it from polytheistic neighbours, preserves fragments that fit the pattern of earlier beings and divine revision, the Nephilim who appear briefly in Genesis chapter 6, offspring of the sons of God and the daughters of men, mighty ones of old, men of renown, beings whose hybrid nature combined divine and human in ways the text treats as problematic, and immediately after mentioning these Nephilim, the Genesis narrative transitions to the flood, the destruction that would wipe the earth clean of all but Noah and his family, implying without stating directly that the Nephilim were part of what went wrong, part of what required correction, part of the pre-flood world that could not be allowed to continue. The Book of Enoch, preserved in the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition and quoted in the New Testament though excluded from most Christian canons, elaborates the Nephilim story in ways that strengthen the parallel with Mesopotamian tradition, describing the Watchers, angelic beings who descended to earth and took human wives, whose offspring the Nephilim were giants of such size and appetite that they consumed all human produce and then began consuming humans themselves, whose corruption spread until the earth cried out for divine intervention, and the flood came as response to this crisis, not merely as punishment for human wickedness, but as correction of a hybridization that had produced beings the cosmic order could not sustain. African traditions from across the continent preserve narratives of earlier humans who failed and were replaced by current humanity. The Yoruba of Nigeria describing beings created before the current human race who proved unsatisfactory. The Dogon of Mali preserving accounts of a first creation that went wrong and required divine correction. The San of southern Africa telling of an earlier race that existed before the current people and was transformed or destroyed, and while these traditions developed independently, while no documented contact connects them to Mesopotamian or Indian or Greek sources, they share the structural pattern of iterative creation, of humanity as a revised edition rather than an original, of the current world emerging from the failure of previous attempts. Pacific Island traditions from Polynesia to Melanesia to Micronesia describe first peoples who preceded current populations, the Hawaiian Menehune, who built structures and then vanished, the Maori Patupaerehi, who inhabited New Zealand before Polynesian arrival, the various accounts across the Pacific of earlier inhabitants who were different from current humans and who withdrew or were displaced as the current populations arrived. And while these traditions often describe the earlier peoples as continuing to exist in remote or hidden places rather than being destroyed, the pattern of succession of current humanity replacing or displacing something that came before persists across cultures that had no contact with the ancient Near East. The global distribution of this pattern, the multiple creations, the failed prototypes, the beings who came before and proved unsuitable, the revisions that produced current humanity, raises questions that scholars have debated without resolution. Are these independent developments arising from common human psychology, projections of our sense that something has been lost onto mythological frameworks? Are they distant echoes of some actual historical experience preserved in distorted form across millennia of transmission? Or are they pointing towards something about the human condition that we cannot fully articulate but repeatedly attempt to express through narrative? The insistence across cultures that humanity was not the first attempt, that something came before and failed, that we exist because earlier versions did not work. This insistence appears too consistently to dismiss as coincidence, too widespread to attribute to diffusion from a single source, too persistent across time and space to ignore as merely quaint mythology. And while the responsible approach acknowledges uncertainty, acknowledges that we cannot know what these parallel traditions ultimately mean, the patterns themselves demand attention, demand consideration, demand at minimum the recognition that human cultures around the world independently developed remarkably similar accounts of a past that included beings other than ourselves, creations that preceded our creation, failures that made our existence necessary. The tone appropriate to this recognition is not certainty but wonder, not conclusion but contemplation, not the assertion that we have found the answer, but the acknowledgement that the question persists across every culture we examine. The question of what came before, the question of whether we are the first or the latest, the question of what it means that so many traditions remember humanity as replacement rather than original, as version 2 or 3 or 4 rather than version 1, as the beings who exist now because earlier beings, for whatever reason, could not continue to exist. And the silence that follows this question, the absence of definitive answers, the persistence of mystery despite centuries of scholarship and excavation and translation, this silence is itself significant, pointing towards something that the ancient peoples knew or believed or experienced that we can approach through their narratives but cannot quite reach, cannot quite recover, cannot quite translate into the frameworks that modern understanding would require for acceptance. The evidence has been laid before you across these hours of quiet contemplation, the tablets and their translations, the archaeological layers and their implications, the parallel traditions from cultures that never met. And now we arrive at the question that all of this evidence poses but cannot answer. The question that has hovered beneath the surface of every text we have examined, every rain length we have calculated, every flood layer we have measured. The question of what it means if the ancient scribes were right. If humanity was indeed created twice, if we exist not as the original divine intention, but as the corrected version of something that came before and failed. 3 interpretations present themselves to the careful mind, 3 frameworks through which the evidence might be understood, and each carries implications that extend far beyond the academic debates of Assyriologists and archaeologists into the realm of how we understand ourselves and our place in whatever order governs existence. The first interpretation treats the creation narratives as mythologized memory of elite governance. The The Anunnaki and Agigi as symbolic representations of ruling classes and labour forces, the flood as metaphor for political collapse, the two creations as cultural processing of regime change through supernatural vocabulary, and this interpretation has the advantage of requiring nothing beyond human psychology and social organisation to explain. The gods becoming projections of earthly power structures, the narrative serving ideological functions that reinforce the authority of those who controlled the temples and the scribal schools where the texts were produced and preserved. The second interpretation treats the creation narratives as psychological archetypes, universal patterns arising from the structure of human consciousness itself, the sense that something has been lost, that an earlier age was better, that we are diminished from what once existed, becoming expressions of a nostalgia built into the human mind, a tendency to imagine golden ages in the past that never actually existed, a way of processing the anxiety of mortality by projecting immortality onto ancestors who never possessed it. And this interpretation explains the global distribution of similar narratives without requiring historical connection, each culture independently generating the same patterns because human minds are structured to generate them. The third interpretation treats the creation narratives as documentation, distorted by time and transmission but preserving the outline of actual events, beings who actually existed before current humanity, a catastrophe that actually reset the system, modifications that were actually implemented to prevent recurrence, and this interpretation requires accepting that the ancient scribes knew something we have forgotten, that their matter-of-fact tone reflected genuine belief in the factual nature of what they recorded, that the administrative precision of the Atrahasis and the Sumerian King List was not literary convention, but historiographical method applied to events the scribes considered historical, and this interpretation raises questions that mainstream scholarship is reluctant to engage, because the implications extend beyond what current paradigms can accommodate. Each interpretation explains some of the evidence while struggling with other aspects. The mythologized memory framework accounts for the political functions of the texts, but not for their global distribution. The psychological archetype framework accounts for the distribution, but not for the specific details that vary in ways suggesting genuine transmission of information. The documentation framework accounts for the specificity and the scribal tone, but requires accepting premises that modern thought has largely abandoned, and the honest assessment acknowledges that we cannot definitively choose among these options, that the evidence supports multiple readings, that the ancient peoples who created these texts are not available for clarification, and that the millennia separating us from them have degraded the signal in ways that may be irrecoverable. What the texts agree on across all their variations, what persists through every version from every culture, is a core claim that resists dismissal. Something came before current humanity, something failed or proved unsuitable or had to be removed, and we exist as the replacement, as the version that came after, as the beings who walk the earth, because earlier beings no longer do. This agreement does not prove that the events described actually occurred, but it does demonstrate that human cultures around the world independently developed the intuition that humanity as we know it was not the first attempt, that our existence represents revision rather than original draft, that the current order emerged from the failure of a previous order, and whether this intuition reflects memory or projection, whether it preserves fact or generates meaning, the intuition itself is real, is documented, is pressing itself into consciousness through narratives that refuse to stop being told. The noise problem that the Atrahasis describes, the rigmu that drove Enlil to authorize plague and famine and finally flood, has acquired new resonance in an age when human population has exceeded 8 billion. When the rigmu of our civilization can be measured in carbon dioxide concentrations and species extinction rates, and the destabilization of climate systems that took millions of years to reach equilibrium. And while responsible analysis resists facile parallels, resists claiming that ancient mythology predicts contemporary crisis, the structural similarity is difficult to ignore. Beings who multiply beyond the capacity of the system to sustain them. Activity that disrupts the order within which activity occurs. Noise that threatens to trigger intervention from forces that humanity cannot control. The post-flood modifications described in the Atrahasis, the limitations on reproduction designed to prevent the noise problem from recurring, appear to have functioned for millennia. Human populations remained relatively stable for most of recorded history, growing slowly, constrained by the disease and famine and infant mortality that the texts present as designed features rather than unfortunate accidents. And only in recent centuries have these constraints been systematically overcome. medicine reducing infant mortality, agriculture increasing food supply, technology extending lifespans, the cumulative effect being population growth at rates that would have been inconceivable to the ancient scribes who recorded the original divine specifications, and whether this overcoming of designed limitations represents human triumph or the repetition of the pattern that triggered the first reset. Whether we are achieving what the gods prevented, or setting up conditions for another intervention, these questions cannot be answered with confidence. They can only be posed with appropriate unease. The identity implications of living as version 2, as replacement rather than original, as corrected edition rather than first draft, extend into philosophical territory that the ancient texts do not directly address, but inevitably raise. If our mortality was designed rather than fallen into, if our limitations are features rather than bugs, if the constraints we experience as suffering were implemented specifically to prevent us from becoming what our predecessors became, then the entire framework through which we understand human existence shifts, suffering becoming specification rather than injustice, death becoming engineering rather than tragedy, the boundaries of our lives becoming walls built to contain something that would otherwise exceed what the system can sustain. The Gilgamesh epic processes these implications through the story of a hero who seeks to transcend his designed limitations and fails, who learns that mortality cannot be circumvented, who returns to his city understanding that the walls he has built are the only immortality available to beings constructed to die. And this narrative closure, this acceptance of limitation as the condition of meaningful existence, represents one way of living with what the creation narratives imply, finding purpose within constraints rather than struggling against them, building legacies that outlast individual lives rather than seeking to extend individual lives beyond their specified duration. The tablets themselves, the physical objects that preserve these narratives, sit today in museum collections around the world, the British Museum in London, the University of Pennsylvania Museum in Philadelphia, the Iraq Museum in Baghdad, the Louvre in Paris, the Yale Babylonian Collection in New Haven, fragments of baked clay that have survived millennia of burial and excavation, and the various catastrophes that have swept across the regions where they were created and stored. And each tablet represents an act of preservation, a scribe pressing wet clay to ensure that something would not be forgotten, firing the tablet to make it permanent, storing it in archives where later generations would find it and copy it and pass it forward. A chain of transmission stretching from approximately 1800 BC to the present moment, nearly 4,000 years of continuous memory. The scribes who created these tablets did not write as poets composing literature, did not write as priests constructing theology, did not write with the expectation that later readers would treat their words as mythologies to be interpreted symbolically. They wrote as administrators documenting what they believed to be fact, using the same conventions they applied to grain inventories and legal contracts and land surveys. And this administrative tone, this bureaucratic precision, is what makes the content so unsettling, because the content describes events that modern readers cannot accept as factual. Gods creating humans to perform labour, divine councils authorising floods, modifications to human biology implemented after catastrophic reset. Yet the form insists on factuality. The genre demands to be read as record rather than story. We cannot know what the scribes actually believed, whether they understood their sources as literal history, or inherited tradition, or something in between, whether they questioned the impossible reign lengths, or accepted them as previous generations had accepted them, whether they felt the unease that modern readers feel, or processed the information through frameworks that made it seem unremarkable. And this uncertainty about ancient belief compounds the uncertainty about ancient events, leaving us with texts whose meaning has become opaque even as their words remain readable. Messages transmitted successfully across millennia, whose content can no longer be decoded with confidence. The memory preserved in these texts, the memory of creation happening twice, of humanity as replacement rather than original, of limitations designed into our nature to prevent the recurrence of failures we can no longer fully describe. This memory sits in climate-controlled vaults, waiting for readers who can recover what has been lost, waiting for understanding that may never arrive, and the waiting is patient because clay is patient, because fired clay can endure for millennia without degrading, because the medium chosen by ancient scribes to preserve what they knew has proven more durable than the civilizations that produced it, more lasting than the languages that gave it meaning, more permanent than the belief systems within which it originally made sense. So here is the question the tablets preserve, pressed into wet clay millennia ago by scribes who believed they were recording fact. If we were made to replace something that failed, if our limitations are features designed to prevent repetition, if our mortality was built in rather than fallen into, does that change how we understand what we are? The Atrahasis does not answer this. It simply remembers, and perhaps that is all any civilization can do, preserve the memory of what came before, even when the meaning has grown dim, even when the full story can no longer be recovered. We are heirs to something we cannot fully name, stewards of knowledge we cannot fully verify, living in a world that may have been reset once already, and somewhere in museums, in climate-controlled vaults, clay tablets still hold wedge-shaped impressions made by hands that believed they were recording. History, not myth, not metaphor, the administrative documentation of how gods made humanity the second time.